Shalom, my name is Joseph Shulam, and I've been doing these mind candies for a while, and I have a new one that I want to share with you. Most of these mind candies are things that Christians, even pastors, and even sometimes some Christian scholars that studied in Bible schools don't really know. And the problem is this, dear brothers and sisters, that the New Testament is not written in English and not written by Christians. Nobody that wrote in the New Testament ever called himself a Christian. And it was written by Jewish disciples and non-Jewish disciples of Yeshua and by apostles. And they lived in the first century in a Hellenistic, Greco-Roman, and Jewish environment. Now, the issue that I want to tackle this mind candy is whether the Apostle Paul was married or not married. Why is this important? First of all, it's important because Christian tradition is that he wasn't married. And it is based on a statement that he made in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that we'll get to it in a minute. Second of all, we know the atmosphere and the world in which Paul was raised in Jerusalem. And yes, he was born in Tarsus, but by his own confession, he was raised in Jerusalem, and his family lived in Jerusalem. He had a sister in Jerusalem, and she had a son, and that son was a radical, and Paul was a radical too. And he was the Attorney General of the High Court of Israel, of the Sanhedrin. How do we know that? We know that by his part in the execution of Stephen. Stephen was a Samaritan convert to Judaism, was a member of the synagogue of the Libertines, which is the synagogue of the converts that met just south of the walls of the city of Jerusalem in those days. And he couldn't have been a Pharisee, as he confesses in Philippians chapter 3, and he couldn't have been a rabbi or a high court appointee by the Sanhedrin unless he was an established person in the community with a family, and by his own mouth he was unmarried. Unmarried means somebody that was married and became unmarried. The word un, or in Latin, Greek, a, before the word reverses the meaning of the word. Yeah, the un-cola is 7-Up. It's not a cola, even if it was made by Coca-Cola Corporation. Yeah, and to undo something is the opposite of do something. And the same thing is true with married. Unmarried is somebody who was married and became unmarried, and we're going to see that in a few minutes. Now, let me start from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the first verse. Now concerning these things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Is it good for a man not to touch a woman? Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also a wife to her husband. Every Jewish wedding has what in the New Testament, in the Gospel, in the Matthew Sermon on the Mount, it's called a document of divorcement. In Hebrew, it's called a document, the ketubah, the written document. And in it, the husband takes responsibility for his wife, including her sexual fulfillment, housing, food, clothing, and everything else. And that's what Paul is talking about. It is somebody wrote him a letter and said, is it good not to be married? Now, this question is not unique in the New Testament during this exact period, folks. During this exact period, we have a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Ishmael, who lived in Jerusalem. And he wrote that it's because of the difficulties of the time, meaning the Roman legions were encompassing Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was being under, tremendous stress by the Romans because there was already rebellion in the camp. The Zealots already rebelled and were causing damage to the Romans. And the Romans with Vespasian and his son Titus brought legions of Roman soldiers, both from Egypt and from Rome, and maybe from other countries as well, like Greece or Asia Minor, to the land of Israel to quench that rebellion. So Rabbi Ishmael says, because of the difficulty of the time, maybe it would be wise for us not to marry and have children during this season. In other words, in the Jewish world, in the Pharisaic world at that time, that was an issue. Somebody writes a letter to Paul and asks him. So Paul answers, it's good for a man to be married. Yes. Each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband, and a husband is responsible for his wife, and a wife is under the responsibility of her husband. She doesn't have authority over her own body, but her husband does, and likewise a husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does have authority over the husband's body. Pretty good arrangement. Equal. And Paul considers, do not deprive each other except with consent for a time, for a season, that it means, and you may give yourself to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and the other one in another manner. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. From this verse 8 in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Christian fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century decided that Paul was not married. But, what shall we say? We have evidence that he was married. First of all, in the verse that I read, verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 7, it says, the unmarried and the widows. He puts the unmarried with the widows. What do the widows have to do with the unmarried? Both of them were married before, but now they're not married. That's the common denominator between a widow and somebody that is unmarried. It's not that the unmarried, in the same chapter, chapter 7, we have the word virgin, which means a woman who never was married, or a man who was never married. He is not an unmarried man, he is a virgin. And she is a virgin, she's never been married. But in this case, the widows and unmarried people are coupled together by the Apostle Paul. That's interesting. But it's even more interesting if we go to chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians and go to chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians verse 5. Look at this text. I'm going to start from 1 Corinthians 9 verse 3 so that we get the context a little bit of what's going on. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, meaning Peter? Mr. Paul, you have right like the other apostles. And you are asking this rhetorical question in chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians verse 5. Do we have no right to take along a believing wife as do the other apostles? That means he has a believing wife, folks. You understand what I'm saying? He asks, do I have a right like the other apostles to take my wife with me? I do. That's the answer. Just as much as I do have a right to drink and to eat like the other apostles, based on my ministry, on my calling from the Lord. Again, I'm repeating verse 5, just to make it clear. The context is, do we have the same right like the other apostles? To eat, to drink, and to have a wife, and to take along our believing wife with us when we travel. The answer is yes, we have a right, just like all the other apostles and the other brothers. The brothers of the Lord means Jacob, James, and Cephas. Verse 6, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense. When you go to war, you don't go on your own expense. You have to have somebody take care of you. And that is the context of this text. Paul had a wife, but he, at this time, like Rabbi Ishmael's advice and other people's advice during these difficult times of the pre-war and the pre-falling of the temple in the year 70, had a wife, but because of the times he became unmarried. And in the same chapter 7, he discusses, what if a husband leaves his wife? Is she free? Or if a wife leaves her husband, is he free? Yes. And this is the Jewish law of that period. If a husband leaves his wife and is not in contact with her for 6 months, she can file for divorce according to Jewish law in the time of the first century in the land of Israel. They didn't have cell phones, they couldn't call. That's interesting within itself. But one more verse before I end. I want to go to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians in the New Testament. Philippians chapter 4, the last chapter. And we're going to look at the first verses. Philippians 4, we're going to look from verse 2 and 3. Notice, I implore Euodia, and I implore syntache, to be of the same mind in the Lord. Verse 3, and I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labor with me in the gospel, and Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Companion. Companion. That is what this text says, companion. Well, companion could be anybody. Yes, companion could be anybody. The only problem with the word companion here is the Greek. The Greek in this text is a problem. I'm going to go to the Greek text over here and read to you what the dictionaries, the best dictionaries, say. Okay, we'll see what the Greek word for that is translated in English translations as companion means. Okay, go to the Greek New Testament over here and go to verse 3. Here is the word, the Greek word. It's the root, the Greek word of the English word genuine, legal. Okay? He's talking about women. He's asking somebody who the English translation calls companion to help these women who are laboring together with him in the gospel. And he's using the word genosios. Genosios. He's not talking about companion, a friend. He's talking about who is genuine, truly belonging to him. He's talking about a woman in the context of women that we have their names, Syntyche and Euodia, and in this context, he's saying to a woman that she is his genuine one, his real one, yeah, to help take care of the other women that are with him. Put together this text, together with the text from 1 Corinthians 9:5, where it says, he says, do I have no right to take a wife, my wife with me? The answer is yes. All these things show that Paul was married. They also show that he was, for at least a season, a long season, separated from his wife and was unmarried for that season, a long time, because according to Galatians he was gone for several years after he became a believer on the road to Damascus. And so, yes, I say Paul was married. I say Paul had a family. And I say that the evidence is such that is overwhelmingly in favor of that position, that Paul was married. Why is this important? Because the Word of God is a guide for us. And we can see a situation, not only under conditions of war like Paul and under Roman occupation and traveling throughout the Mediterranean Roman Empire, had some very challenging situations in his marriage. He puts the unmarried, which is himself, he calls himself unmarried, with the widows, those that had husbands and now are either the husband died or they're separated and don't have a husband right now. He puts them together. I think that Paul was married. And for me, that is important because it gives me the possibility, not that I will leave my wife or separate myself from my wife, but the possibility not to condemn others who have difficult circumstances in their marriages and sometimes have to take some time off, something that is not so widely advised in the Western Church. Yes, God bless you all. This is Mind Candy.